everybody. Welcome back to another episode of The Blind Spot. Today, we have a wonderful guest, Lukáš Likavčan. We were just talking about how to, my ability to pronounce things is pretty bad. Unless it's Jones, I'm in trouble. So Lukáš and I have known each other for a couple of years. We were introduced through the Berggruen Institute, actually. And we just recently completed a paper about the idea of the planetary and things like planetary metabolism. Lukáš is a bright young philosopher, and he's the one who introduced me to the idea of environmental humanities, ways of thinking about climate and the future that, imbibe the science, digest the science, but are really about philosophy, political science, the arts, all of that. So, Lukáš, I'm going to let you get started and just tell us a little bit about your background and the kind of questions that you're interested in.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. So grateful to be part of this today. I guess that the best way how to introduce myself is to simply say that I'm a philosopher, and specifically a philosopher of emerging technologies, ecology, and astronomy. So these are kind of like the three compartments that nevertheless kind of work together in my perspective on philosophy. And I would say that these three compartments already give us a certain glimpse into what I do, in the sense that I often oscillate between, let's say, planetary and extraplanetary context of thinking. So one of the ways, or kind of like a tagline that I would put into the way how I describe my work often is I'm trying to think about ecology somehow like after, beyond, without, or perhaps even outside nature. So in a certain sense, ecology and environment for me becomes like a concept that is really not just about, let's say, animals, geology, biogeochemistry, etc. Like I'm trying to think about ecology in a little bit more expanded sense. And of course, the primary stake in most of my research is the question of planetary habitability, which in itself is a concept that kind of like moves between astrobiology, exoplanet research, and ecology, because it gets, let's say, like different connotations, different flavors as it travels across these different disciplines. And this kind of, I would say, like a disciplinary nomadism is something that is kind of like close to me, both in the sense of like me as a researcher, but also in the sense of the concepts that I'm tracking, that I'm often translating or mediating concepts between different domains, let's say, of knowledge making.
Yeah, that's one of the things I thought has always been interesting to me when talking with you, right? So on the one hand, like we got started talking about astrobiology, one of my domains of, life on other planets. What does it mean? There's so much philosophical sort of input to that science, but then also thinking about climate now, and and the Anthropocene and what it means to how different is a city from a forest? How should we think about them differently? But I'm interested in this idea that you have about like this idea of habitability and how it changes as it moves from astrobiology, where it really just means formally the habitable zone is where there's liquid water. Which planets can you have liquid water on? But then when it comes over to the studies of the sustainability and the Anthropocene, is your planet habitable for a technological civilization, right? It may be that, sure, you're fine for a biosphere, but you can't have 8 million people on your planet all eating food or something. So talk a little bit about that idea of how this concept of habitability changes as it travels between these disciplines.
Well, that's a really good question, to the extent that, it's pretty much an open debate at the moment, like how to frame this transition or change. And if I refer to someone that I guess is a big reference for me in how to think about habitability outside of astrobiology, is definitely Dipesh Chakrabarty, who is a scholar, a historian of ideas primarily at University of Chicago. And I think his work, what is really important in his work at the moment is that he tries to find this difference between, let's say, or describe the difference between sustainability and habitability, in the sense that sustainability, and also if we simply look at the history of, Brundtland Commission, all this history of defining sustainability as a goal of international development or a goal of, let's say, economic in the context of economic growth, for example, how to make growth sustainable, both from the perspective of the sustainability, let's say, of revenues, but also from the perspective of sustainability of the material and energetic basis of society. Well, I mean, there is always a certain let's say, way how this idea of sustainability loops back to the human. It's always about one kind of agents and the well-being of one kind of agents, which is humans, sometimes only specific kind of humans, yeah? Many times, like, sustainability is defined through, let's say, intergenerational prism. So it's about, like, not eating up the lunch of the future generations. But of course, I mean, there are also, let's say, like, less, let's say, like, generation-centric definitions of sustainability. But the point now is that the moment we enlarge the scope of, let's say, relevant stakeholders to the biosphere at large, suddenly we get very close to the idea of habitability as we find it in astrobiology. That's exactly the moment where Chakrabarty's translation of habitability into the domain of environmental humanity steps in. That there is a possibility to formulate a larger goal, an agenda, which is not just about preserving resources for future generations, but it is about a certain kind of, let's say, interspecies flourishing, if you will. And then the question is, of course, it sounds a little bit vague at this point, and then the philosophical work to be done, and the one that I'm really interested in is, like, how to, let's say, specify these different conditions of habitability. And that's exactly the moment when, to me, astrobiology arrives, especially in its most recent and more speculative provenances, when we talk about habitability outside of the traditional habitable zone, outside of the conditions of carbon-based life or surface level water, when we're talking about habitability, let's say, that implicitly considers expansion or a certain kind of, like, distortion of the definition of what is life, or kind of like the underlying theory of life. And then, I mean, like, we can ask the question, what is the life worth living? What is the life worth preserving? What kinds of life forms are the stakeholders in the habitability of our planet?
Yeah, this is what I find really interesting. And I think, it ties, with Evan, this kinds of things we talked about in the last chapter of the book, right? We sort of pointed to Earth system science and astrobiology as sort of being, which was implicit in that, as being sort of the sciences that go beyond the blind spot, because they sort of force you to push past your sort of reductionist ideas about life as machine, it's just a machine, etc. So yeah, I find this to be a really kind of compelling, different way of thinking about it. So Lucas and I were just at this meeting in Germany on the planetary perspectives. And in a moment, Lucas, I'm going to ask you to describe what we mean by the planetary as opposed to the global. But what was interesting to me, this idea of, and I'm sure, Evan, you're more familiar with this idea of the environmental humanities, because you could say, like, look, climate change is just a problem of, it's planetary science. Why are we bringing in philosophy or, political science or English literature? Because this idea that, like, this is something we're going to talk about. We're going to blow past 1.5 degrees. That seems amazingly, sadly obvious now. And that means the Holocene is over, the time that all of human, quote unquote, civilization emerged from the Holocene. And we're leaving it. We've pushed the planet past that, which means that every part of culture is going to change. Yeah, so actually for both Evan and Lucas, I'm interested in sort of what you guys think about this idea of how all of the things that go into culture will change or can change or may change because of this shift. Actually, Evan, I'll just turn it over to you. Sort of, what's your sort of perspective on that idea of the environmental humanities?
Well, there's ways in which I'm very sympathetic to it, and there's ways in which I have problems with it, I suppose. And the way in which I'm sympathetic to it, of course, is the need to think about the environment and ecology and the planetary and the things that Lucas was just talking about, sustainability versus habitability and so on, from perspectives that include, history, literature, philosophy. Of course, I'm sympathetic to that. But at the same time, I think that the very concept of the humanities, as opposed to the natural sciences, the social sciences, already encodes the problem that we're, struggling with. And so, I mean, this is the nature of universities. Of course, universities are fossilized structures that reflect out of date, ways of dividing up the world. So in that sense, I think, well, it's, and here I'm actually very influenced by my father, who was, very concerned with the planetary and came out of the humanities, but, created dialogues across the humanities and the sciences in a way that really tried to, push beyond the difference between something that would be called the humanities and something that would be called the sciences to organize knowledge in a very different way. I mean, so here's how I would, put it, and I'd be very interested in what Lukáš, would think about this, is that part of the challenge is we need new ways of organizing knowledge and theoretically and practically. And the distinction between the humanities and the sciences, I think, is out of date for dealing with the crisis that we're facing, both in our local human situation and in the effort to think about ourselves as merely one ripple in a much larger fabric of life and its possibilities. So I'd be interested in, how does someone in the environmental humanities, as it were, think about the very concept of the environmental humanities in that light?
I mean, I encounter a certain level of kind of like discipline. I feel sometimes that I'm a little bit of a disciplinary misfit because I don't think that I'm even a good environmental humanities scholar in this sense. When I submit something sometimes to, let's say, environmental humanities journals, they tell me, yeah, but there is not enough environmental humanities. There's too much like astrobiology literature, etc. And
then, that's a good sign. That's a good sign.
Yeah. But I mean, to the concept of humanities in the concept of let's say in the context of university education and a certain compartmentalization of knowledge, I totally hear that the challenge is in the organization of knowledge making, and I think in a certain sense is not a position dissimilar to the position in which astrobiology found itself as a science. I mean, I think 2 years ago there was this wonderful short article in Nature Astronomy by Cyril Jean-Colas, where the authors say that the name of the article is Astrobiology Serious Science? ? And the paper is exactly about what are the hurdles that a science which is natively interdisciplinary faces in this kind of academic environment. Because in astrobiology you meet people who are, and Adam knows it very well, people who are astrophysicists, people who are, let's say, origins of life researchers, earth system sciences, etc., etc. Of course, it's just interdisciplinary in the sense of natural sciences, but why not think about historians or even anthropologists, especially in the context of SETI, as relevant knowledge makers in the astrobiological context. So I mean, this is more like a footnote on how this is not a challenge just for environmental humanities, but also for the sciences. Certain versions of environmental humanities, such as mine, are trying to draw from. But also, in a certain sense, and that also leads me to Adam's question about culture, we need to understand science as making of culture and culture as the making of knowledge. And it's an important feedback loop here between culture and knowledge making, in the sense that many kinds of cultural products encode knowledge, disseminate knowledge, even produce, let's say, basic conditions for the emergence of new knowledge, in the sense that culture is a giant pursuit of the collective encoding of the memory of people and the society at large, that is transmitted through writing, but also different kinds of material infrastructures, written inscriptions on the walls of the ancient cities are culture and knowledge making, or kind of records of the past knowledge at the same time. So I feel there may be a way how to approach this problem of disciplinary boundaries through taking more, let's say, advice from the transdisciplinary practices that are native, for example, to art, to design, to architecture, where you see this kind of a cross-pollination and a different kind also of education. You don't have individual programs, but you have studios where people working on projects with different skill sets coming together. And I feel this kind of a studio education may be an interesting template for humanities and even certain kinds of natural sciences, as we are trying to, let's say, build up the edifices of the new kinds of knowledge making.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. We're actually looking to the arts and artistic practices and design practices because they're so inherently, hybridizing and fusion-y, and that's, I think, a very kind of fertile and stimulating model or image for for how to collaborate. Really, it's really, when you go into an artist studio, because my wife used to be a contemporary dance artist. Now she's a neuroscientist. So when you go into a dance studio or you go into an arts collective, it's all about how do we work together, how do we collaborate, and you don't have policing boundary questions. It's really
you're
about,
a musician. Stick to your music. You're not allowed to think about the painting on the wall. Yeah, right.
Exactly. And that's very refreshing and very, very stimulating. And very, in those environments, often, it's very welcoming to science, to philosophy. And when you go in as a scientist or philosopher into that environment and you do your own work, the process is very different, and the sense of what would count as productive or successful becomes very different. So I think that's a great idea.
I just like that we've opened this space. I think this is interesting. And for our viewers, right? I mean, this is something, that we're doing, I hope, that in general is not being heard on other science podcasts, right? Usually it's like science, it's all about science. Right. Science is, history, the literature. Yeah, sure. That's adorable. You go ahead and do that. But right, the recognition, especially in the face of what's coming down the road for us, right? Since we're talking about climate and the fact that, the Holocene is ending, pretty much a friend has pointed this out, and also Berggruen, Jonathan Blake, that, every human institution from, the nature of the state down to like the definitions of marriage are Holocene definitions. They were formed in the last 10,000 years when the glaciers melted. Right. And we got a warm, moist, stable climate. That's ending. We, amazingly enough, we could not stop ourselves. But so we're entering into an entirely new phase. And this question of like, how do you reorganize knowledge in the midst of that? I mean, we probably have to do it anyway, because that's what we're arguing in the blind spot, that these old views don't really work. The old silos and the sort of the philosophies of reductionism and thinking that math exists by itself out in the universe. Those are very limiting. But yeah, then also just the thing that we've done to the planet is going to force culture to change. So this question of like how reorganizing knowledge that includes science, but doesn't say that science is the ground of it all, right? Because that beforehand, what people would say is like, oh, you're doing art, that's great, but really it's just neuroscience, right? It's just there's some neurons in there that evolution triggered you to be able to, and I think we reject that. That art is a way of knowing. There are spiritual practices that are ways of knowing. There's just a lot of ways of knowing. And science is a totally potent, perhaps one of the most powerful, given its collective nature, historical nature. But it's not the only way.
Totally. But on that point also, we should recognize that there are certain almost artistic sensibilities that sometimes come with doing science. Like if I think about the way how optics and optical observation in the visible, but also outside of the visible spectrum of light is important in the history of astronomy. I mean, there is a certain sensibility in decoding, for example, the spectrum, like being able to see, like it's almost as if we were approaching some kind of natural archive and kind of like unlocking the information, the messages that are hidden in the given ray of light that, for example, travels to us reflected from the atmosphere of the distant exoplanet. And the same, for example, I was recently looking a little bit into how dark matter is being observed through like all its indirect, let's say, manifestations. For example, the way how satellite galaxies, what are the trajectories and the speeds of the satellite galaxies around bigger galaxies such as ours. And again, I mean, there is a beautiful sensibility to the negative that is being built there, the ability to appreciate that there is a, let's say, like a negative space of the universe that you are able to see only through its indirect manifestations. And all these sensibilities, those are translatable to the other domains of human, almost like everyday life, just like how to live with uncertainty, how to give space to a certain kind of uncertainty. It's very similar to the uncertainty of a scientist. I mean, tracing dark matter, but not being able to name what exactly that entity is, because it's just like a hypothetical stipulation.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I wanted to ask both of you a question. This is shifting a little bit, but maybe not actually. So, Adam, you mentioned several times, the Holocene and how, the Holocene is an epoch that we're emerging out of into something else. I read, it was a few days ago, and I wish I could remember exactly where, but it might have been a science editorial. And the headline was something, the concept of the Anthropocene is dead. And the argument was basically, the Anthropocene was this attempted definition for a new geological epoch, but geologists haven't been able to agree on what it is and don't accept it anymore. And so the concept is dead. And I thought it was an interesting, one, I just wanted your reaction to that, both of you. But two, I thought it was an interesting instance of the blind spot, because you could say, well, the concept was introduced maybe originally in a geological setting, but it quickly ramified way beyond that. It became a concept across, across the environmental humanities, obviously, and it took on a different kind of life. And so the idea that the concept was dead just struck me as, this seems a very peculiar way of looking at things that's blind actually to the life that the concept has. So I wanted your reactions to that.
Yeah, let me do quickly, and then I'd be interested in Lucas. Just like exactly the blindness of that. So it originally started as a concept in, I can never pronounce this, stratigraphy, right? It was supposed to be defined, the way, geological epochs and eras are defined is by, changes in the strata. And so it started there, and I think it took like 15 years or something, or 10 years, from the time it was proposed to the time that the International Commission on Stratigraphy, decided, like, no, we're not going to accept that. But like, exactly as you said, it took on so much more force than that, because what it became was a recognition that human beings were the primary forcing on the planetary systems, which is like kind of undeniable now. So like that somebody would write an article like that is literally so blind to the fact that this idea may have started off with like some hyper technical definition of the amount of niobium 26 in, a layer of rock, and see that like, oh, for whatever reasons, the geologists decided we're not going to make that thing, and be like, the concept's dead. And like literally not see that the whole rest of human culture picked up on, including scientifically, picked up on in other domains. It just sort of shows why these fields need to be transdisciplinary and not, the individual silos that scientists find themselves in and want to protect the boundaries of, are just not up to the task of what faces us. So that's my take on it. Lucas?
I deeply resonate with this. I would simply add that the value of the concept is not how long it is with us, but where does it give out? What is the kind of like road it points at? Where does it take us? And we are definitely in a very different paradigm now, thanks to the concept of the Anthropocene, thanks to the fact that we suddenly have environmental social sciences, environmental philosophy, kind of like deeper integrated with so many other natural sciences, because the fact that a concept which originates in natural sciences and resonates in the social sciences, this is in itself a big deal, I would say, like for a certain kind of setting the stage for like a productive knowledge transmission and kind of like a translation of concepts like across different ways of knowledge making. But also, I mean, in a certain way, the concept of the Anthropocene was useful as also an onboarding device for a certain generation of scholars. I mean, like, I was a person who was like 20 years old when I first heard about Anthropocene. And for me, it was really defining in a certain sense what I want to work on. I didn't know back then that I'm going to end up doing the things I'm doing now. I just knew that the concept of the Anthropocene is a good way how to simply explain that we make certain things, we modify environment, and the environment changes us in return. So if we want to think about something as basic in philosophy as, let's say, what is the human condition, this is something that becomes like extremely important to recognize the environmental modifications that also shape us. I mean, in the end, evolutionary biologists call it niche construction, yeah? Like the ability of the given species to sort of like carve out its own bespoke environment and not being just a passive responder on like what the nature brings it, but also kind of like being the maker of its own fate in a certain way. And these are the moments that to me are also very, very potent from the perspective of like how to think about history, because also that's what Chakrabarti was. What was the Chakrabarti starting point, like as a scientist or as a scholar who's interested in history? Like how does the concept of history change under current condition of the Anthropocene? It's a profound question, which is profound even without Anthropocene being in the way how it is put.
Yeah, I think that's really telling. And that's why, in general, I'm the snarky one in this group, but it just, that somebody would write an article like that just pisses me off. Like, how blind and narrow can you be that you couldn't see all this other things happening? Like, you just literally have blinders on and you can't see, because the idea of the technosphere, right? Which has become, really important for, sustainability studies, for, and for astrobiology, that, the Anthropocene and the idea of the technosphere are very closely wedded, and that the idea of the technosphere is really a very guiding principle. So for people who don't know, right? So there's the biosphere, right? So the biosphere is a relatively new term. That was 1924. It was the Russian geophysicist Vladimir Vernadsky who came up with it, or really popularized it. It had been around before, a little bit beforehand. So that's just the sum total of the planetary life and how that dominates the history of the planet. And the technosphere, which was really originated by the geologist, I think it was Peter Haff. Is that?
Peter Haff, yeah.
Peter Haff passed away, unfortunately. Really brilliant guy who sort of recognized that, all the technology we're building is kind of has, as its total, is almost bigger than us, and it's its own driver of the planet. And this is something Lucas and I worked on in this last paper, was this idea of a mature technosphere versus an immature technosphere. But just that ability to miss, whoever wrote that is just thinks that scientific definition is the only thing that matters. So it's just, that narrowness is kind of what we're pushing back against, and it just doesn't make sense for the moment that we're living in.
I want to ask both of you, but especially Lukáš, from your perspective, would you say the Anthropocene remains a useful concept, or it was a kind of transitional concept? It's like we needed it to get to a new way of thinking, but maybe it's outlived its usefulness, it's got problems. I'd be interested in hearing both of your thoughts, but maybe starting with Lukáš on that.
Okay, I think it is useful concept pedagogically in a certain sense. If you want to onboard someone into some landscape of thinking, into some way of thinking, it can be like a good onboarding device, especially if those people come, let's say, from more like an empirical or exact science, experimental based background. So in this sense, I mean, it remains valuable, sometimes a little bit as a marketing tool, sometimes a little bit as a pedagogical tool. There's a certain strategic importance to that concept, because in a certain way, it is not just a way of looking at the world, but it is also an entry point to a certain, let's say, it comes with certain assumptions about how we make knowledge, how to do science in the interdisciplinary setting. It's a little bit like a singularity that once that you are swallowed in, there's like more to sort of unpack than just this one node, which is the Anthropocene. But of course, in this sense, I also want to downplay maybe a little bit the future role of the concept of the Anthropocene, because it doesn't have to stay just a concept that is going to always struggle for its recognition by natural scientists. Maybe it's going to be fully adopted by social sciences and humanities. Maybe that adoption already started in the moment when Anthropocene was still discussed as a legitimate proposal for a new geological epoch. But I mean, since it kind of like lost this traction, let's say in stratigraphy or geology, it doesn't mean that it cannot continue to be a concept that is going to have a certain kind of like transitory value for other ways of knowledge making.
Yeah, I would just add briefly that again, sort of, if you have a term that people are picking up on, and it's being discussed, and as you said, for the onboarding, if it allows people to get the central idea, which is that the technosphere is now like a dominant force in driving the planet. So for example, I think this number is correct, 70% of the mass of mammals on the planet are ours, right? Are cows and goats and chickens. That's an example of the Anthropocene, right? When something becomes useful like that, you don't abandon it unless, because I've heard people say, oh, we should call it the capital O-scene, or it's like, yeah, whatever. It's like this term now has wheels, it's rolling downhill. it embraces the main idea that you want to get, that human beings are driving the climate state of the planet, then it just has so much use that, I wouldn't see abandoning it now for narrow sort of disciplinary needs or things people want to correct the political definition of it. I just think it has really what you want. And if you try and get rid of it and replace it with something else, it's like, from the marketing side, if you're trying to convince people wow, the planet's changing, we need to do something about it, you don't get rid of your brand. You don't say oh, we used to be called Coca-Cola, but now we're going to be called a drink that has sugar and caramel in it because it's more accurate.
What about if we ask it in a normative way? So somebody might ask, well, is the project to make a better Anthropocene, or is it to move into something that wouldn't be properly designated an Anthropocene? What's your thought about that?
Definitely better Anthropocene. And I think there are several entry points. The first one, I kind of still have this earlier question by Adam on culture in my mind, because one of the threads that I wanted to kind of follow here is also that when I was talking about environmental modification, niche construction, that's also how culture is done. And basically, in this sense, the concept of the Anthropocene also gives us a very urgent sense that any action has material and energetic consequences. That any action, and this is a concept that we are unpacking more in the paper with Adam, is a certain form of metabolizing the world. The changing of the world by metabolizing it. And in this sense, also, the concept of the Anthropocene gave us a very good ground for seeing how these material changes propagate. What does it mean, for example, for computation to have material and energetic consequences? What does it mean for any form of human cultural activity or even economy to actually not be just the realm of internal circulation of money, and then there are some externalities somewhere out there, but that what we consider in the classical economic thinking externalities are actually the meat and bones of the economy.
Yeah, and I would also say, I think part of the Anthropocene is the recognition that, a technological species is what the biosphere is doing now. That's kind of the experiment the biosphere is running. You pull back and you sort of see that the biosphere has done many interesting new things, like grasslands. For a while, were the new thing. There was a time when there was no grass, and then there was grass, and you got things like prairies. And prairies completely changed. It was a new kind of biome, and it changed how the Earth's systems functioned. And so, it's not and there's a certain way in which we can't avoid having some kind of Anthropocene, right? Because we're here, there's a lot of us, we use a lot of energy. Right. And unless, the goal is for us to die, or sort of reduce our numbers to, a few hundred million, and no matter what, we'll always have an effect. But because of what we do and our capacities to harvest energy, we're going to have some effect. And so then the question is, what kind of Anthropocene should it look like? The way we're doing now, it's going to be a difficult one. But also part of that is the recognition is that difficult part, because we were stupid, may be what drives us to figure out how to have a good one, right? Or have a better one. Because
exactly.
But I think it's just the recognition that, once something like us shows up, if the planet is to remain habitable for something like us, and then maybe not, the planet just moves on with the changes that we've pushed and invents something new and we're mostly gone. But that it's the recognition that there was, in some sense, when something like us shows up, you're probably going to get an Anthropocene. This just question is what it looks like.
Yeah, I remember, when I was growing up, 70s, 80s, the sort of debate, especially in the counterculture around, what today we would call environmentalism, was between, the deep ecology people who were basically the human footprint should ideally be minimized as much as possible. And then the kind of, James Lovelock Gaia people who were, much more, no, we should create a technosphere that's, although that term wasn't used then, but we should create a kind of planetary informational technological lattice that was interwoven with planetary dynamics, on a large scale. And so Jim Lovelock was very pro-nuclear power because he thought, well, from that perspective, actually nuclear power is much better than, fossil fuels. And this drove the deep ecologists nuts, right? And so they, they really, but I mean,
out, villain.
So from the perspective of today, it seems like, well, that was a debate back then, but there is a sort of more underlying, enduring philosophical question that was in that debate, which is, what is the human in relationship to nature? Is the human something that, in relation to planetary nature, is it something that that should continue on a kind of trajectory that is an Anthropocene one, where it's a driving force in planetary dynamics, or is it something where that's not the right way to think about it, and it should be scaled back? You might say scaling back is unrealistic, short of major catastrophe. I mean, of course, but the ethical question is an interesting one, right?
Yeah. To me, I often reframe this in the sense that the classical environmentalism was always normatively about what is natural and what is not natural. And based on what we consider natural, that is going to be good. Nuclear is not natural because in a certain deep ecological framing of nature, there is nothing like fusion or fission of atoms. But I mean, if you expand nature and suddenly you include stars, then I mean you are just mimicking nature in a certain sense by doing not fission but fusion in this sense. But I mean, we could definitely find many examples of naturally occurring fission as well. But I mean, the point here really is that when you are asking also what is the human with respect to is, I mean, I think that Adam, by way how he introduced here the concept of the technosphere through Peter Huff, I mean, pointed at the fact that humans are the constitutive builders of the technosphere. And so in this sense, I mean, there is a certain role to responsibly steer this process. It doesn't mean that we become captains of the planet, but there is definitely an important subroutine that was kickstarted by our species and that remains tied to our further development, in the sense that it is us, because it's our niche, it's our environment that we constructed, and in a certain sense it remains an expression of our bodies, of our capacities as the species. So wherever we go, we cannot help ourselves but modify the environment with cultural and technology as the material embedding of culture.
The question you were asking, Evan, about sort of the ethical framework is one that can't be separated on some level from also, sort of the political and the strategic, right? So one of the questions, there was a Dutch professor at this meeting who gave a talk that was, the topic, the title was, "Why did environmental politics fail?" Right? We've had 30 years, of knowing, it's been much longer than that, about climate change, but it was, it was 88 was the famous congressional hearings where James Hansen said climate change is here, right? And what's extraordinary is that climate change is pretty apparent now in the news. It's not like, oh, here, look at this abstract curve, of temperature proxy versus time. The red skies over New York because the fires in Ontario, the red skies over San Francisco because the fires in the Pacific Northwest. It's all pretty clear that it's happening. And you can blame certainly greed, because that was true. I mean, one giant reason is because rich people who have a stake in keeping fossil fuels made sure that, that nothing was done. But on the other hand, everybody's a little bit culpable. We're all driving cars, we're all part of the society. So collectively, humanity certainly didn't decide to do anything about it. And one can ask is from at least the people who were trying to convince others. And I was part of this. I was writing for NPR, back in 2009. What went wrong? What did we do? And
so what was his answer? What was his answer of why the politics failed?
I think a lot of, Lucas, do you remember? I'll let you take that. Lucas, what do you remember the talk? What would he?
I wish I remembered exactly what was the point, but the big part is about narratives, really. I think his name was Martin Heyer. Yeah, he was. He's been studying narratives a lot, the narratives of climate change, and I think the big part was a certain sense of alienation from the language of how climate change is communicated. I think it also testifies to his background, because he was for, I think, over 10 years a civic servant in the Netherlands. So he was actually in the business of governing Netherlands and doing also communicating a certain politically sensitive issues or politically relevant issues. And so this focus on the narratives also like brings me to the one of the potential, let's say, factors of the failure here, which is the failure to simply respond to the needs through the right language, like especially the problem of the needs of the demographies who now feel abandoned by, let's say, social welfare state, or feel abandoned by certain parties who were, let's say, like talking about progressive values. And the climate politics was a big part, of course, of these rhetorics as well, especially in the recent years. And this sense of alienation just like kept sort of like growing and growing over time, because in a certain sense, people didn't feel that this is our environmentalism. I mean, I really like the recent analysis of Holly Jean Bach, who wrote about conspiracy theories as chemtrails, for example, as something like a pseudo-environmentalism or folk environmentalism. That in the absence of a narrative that you can claim as yours, you will simply go for whatever is going to be the available set of like languages that you can use. If the language of climate science is not usable for you to name your concerns in your local environment, you will make up concerns. You will name it in the ways that will lead you down to the rabbit holes of like pseudoscience and conspiracies.
Yeah, I think one of the other things so this idea of narrative and narrative for whom? I mean, climate change became something which was very much advocacy, was something that was very much associated with college educated, just like all the other things that happened, sort of, a certain political class. But like when it came to, you remember the Green Vest riots in France, where like, the government, to deal with climate change, had raised the price of gasoline, and the Green Vest guys were, truck drivers, and they're like, I can't afford. So it was this sort of thing that so much of the environmental movement was this thing like, everybody's going to die. You stink because, you're using you're not part of the solution. And, by the way, you're going to have to get less. You're going to end up with less because we all have to give up something. And it was kind of it's a politically losing philosophy. And especially, I mean, that's a politically losing philosophy to begin with in a democracy. We're going to give you less, because you're bad. And then on top of it, to actually then give them less, that the policies actually made life more difficult for these constituencies, the proposed policies. Telling coal miners that, well, you're going to lose your job. Sorry, tough luck. We promise to retrain you. Like, good luck getting votes in that case. So I'm not really sure what the solution is, but I think it was these very disconnected narratives that just sort of thought that there wouldn't be a backlash. So somehow figuring out how to have narratives for climate change that are still about abundance.
With coal miners, for example, there is definitely a sense of identity that comes with that kind of job. Very strong sense of identity, strong sense of community. I don't know how it is in US, but I know a little bit about, for example, coal miners in Eastern Europe. And there is a certain pride that comes with this job. There is a certain history that almost there is an aura that they sort of like really cherish about their job. And so if someone comes from above who never been a miner, someone like a politician or like a local bureaucrat, and they told them that now you have to be retrained to operators of windmills, for example, of course, I mean, they're going to kind of like they're kind of like destroying the center, or they aiming at the center of their identity in a certain way. So of course there's going to be a massive backlash. But I mean, this is also a cautionary tale in a certain way about like what are the entry points for, let's say, negotiation, communication, like how to first understand the structure of people's belief systems before we are trying to fundamentally change these belief systems, and down the line also their way of acting in the world. Their consumer choices, their opinions about what is good and bad policy, etc.
Yeah, that's so important.
Yeah, so I think we're actually getting to the point, we're at 46 minutes. So, Lucas, it might be good to have you back on again.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think we should definitely have you back on. We just sort of scratched the surface.
We just scratched the surface, because it would be nice to talk about this. So one of the let's close on next episode, or whenever the next episode we have Lucas on. So what Lucas and I were exploring in the paper about the planetary. We didn't even get to the idea of the planetary versus the global, but it was the idea. Part of it was thinking about the technosphere and metabolism, and thinking about it as an organism, thinking about it in the ways that we think about organisms. Because one of the things that Evan and I and Marcelo are so interested in is these new visions of life, this new scientific perspective on life, which takes organism and the organization of the organism as really the radical thing that science doesn't understand and doesn't have needs to get a grip on. So I think maybe just as a way of pointing to the future, that is something maybe that we could pick up on next time, Lucas, is to sort of let's unpack that a little bit more. As well as then also talk about, we really didn't even talk about astrobiology. Lucas has got some really interesting, some of the stuff you've done on the Drake equation.
Oh, we need to talk about Fermi paradox. Yeah. We need to talk about Fermi paradox as something more than just like a sci-fi or like a speculative pastime. It's an important ecological device.
Wow. Okay. There you go.
That sounds good. That
sounds good. All right. Well, on that note, tune in. I don't know. Well, I guess at some point we should publish a schedule so people know what's coming. I don't know what next time will be, but we will have Lucas on again as soon as we can get him on again to continue the conversation. So, all right, everybody, thank you very much. Have a good couple of weeks until you hear from us again. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.